In 2013, a team of researchers at the University of Michigan did something that should have made headlines around the world. They killed rats. And then they watched what happened inside their brains. What they recorded in the 30 seconds after clinical death was so unexpected, so completely opposite to what they assumed they'd find, that the lead scientist sat on the data for months before he published it, because he didn't know what to do with it. The brain wasn't shutting down, it was turning on. And what that means for every human being who has ever died, which is eventually all of us, is something science is only now beginning to understand. Let's start with what death actually is, because most people get this wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. We treat death like a light switch. One moment it's on, the next it's off. The heart stops, the brain goes dark, you cease. But that's not what happens. That's never been what happens. Death is not a moment. It is a process, a slow, measurable, physiologically documented cascade of events that unfolds over minutes, sometimes longer, and inside that process, things happen that nobody predicted and nobody has fully explained. Here's what the science actually says. When your heart stops, blood stops moving. Within about 10 seconds, your brain runs out of oxygen and you lose consciousness. This is the moment most people think of as death, the moment the lights go out. But the cells in your brain don't die at that moment. They begin to die. There's a difference, a significant one. Your neurons. The cells that carry every thought you've ever had, every memory, every version of yourself you've ever been. They can survive without oxygen for somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes before the damage becomes irreversible. That window, those few minutes between when your heart stops and when your brain cells actually begin to die. That is the territory this video is about. And what happens inside it will change how you think about everything. In 2013, neuroscientist Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan hooked up 9 rats to an electroencephalogram, a device that measures electrical activity in the brain, and stopped their hearts. She expected to watch the brain go quiet. Instead, she watched it explode. In the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, the rats' brains showed a surge of highly synchronized gamma waves. Gamma waves are associated with the highest states of conscious activity in the human brain. Focused attention, vivid perception, heightened awareness. The kind of brain activity you'd expect from someone at peak concentration, not someone who had just died. The signal was stronger after death than it had been during life. Borjigin sat on that data for months. When she finally published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the neuroscience community did not know what to make of it. Some called it a final electrical storm, a meaningless mechanical discharge as the system failed. Others suggested something far more uncomfortable, that the dying brain might not be shutting down experience. It might be intensifying it. Think about what that means for a moment, because here's where it gets stranger. Borjigin's study on rats was striking, but rats are not humans. So in 2023, a team led by Dr. Ajmal Zemar at the University of Louisville recorded something they never planned to record: a dying human brain. A patient had suffered a cardiac arrest during continuous EEG monitoring. The team couldn't save the patient, but the machine kept running. And what it captured in the 30 seconds before and after the heart stopped was almost identical to what Borjigin had seen in rats a decade earlier. A surge of gamma wave activity right at the border of death. The human brain, in its final moments, produced the same electrical signature of heightened conscious experience that it produces during vivid dreaming and memory recall. Zemar published the findings in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience. He was careful with his language. Scientists always are. He said the data raised the possibility that the brain might be generating a last review of important life events. Not a random discharge, a review. As in, the thing people have been describing for centuries as their life flashing before their eyes might have a measurable neurological basis. Your brain might actually do that. And not as a malfunction, as a feature. But here's the part nobody talks about, because the science of dying brains is only one piece of this. The other piece has been sitting in hospitals for decades, quietly accumulating in ways that mainstream medicine has never quite known how to categorize. Near-death experiences, NDEs. The clinical term for what happens when people come back. And they come back with something. In 2008, Dr. Sam Parnia launched the AWARE study. Awareness during resuscitation. It was the largest scientific investigation ever conducted into what happens to human consciousness during cardiac arrest. Parnia placed images on shelves near the ceilings of resuscitation rooms in hospitals across the United States and the United Kingdom. The images were positioned so they could only be seen from above. Not from a hospital bed, not from the floor, only from a vantage point near the ceiling. The point was simple. If patients who had cardiac arrests reported floating above their bodies and seeing things in the room, he could verify whether what they described matched what was actually there. Over several years, Parnia documented 2,060 cardiac arrest events. Of those patients, 330 survived. Of those survivors, 140 had enough awareness to be interviewed. And of those 140, a significant number described experiences of unusual clarity during the period when their hearts had stopped. One patient, verified, documented, cross-checked, accurately described the specific actions of the nurses and doctors in the room during the minutes his heart wasn't beating. He described the automated defibrillator making a specific sound. He described a nurse's specific reaction. He was clinically dead when all of it happened. Parnia published the results in Resuscitation in 2014. He did not claim proof of an afterlife. He is a scientist. What he said was this: the recalled experience of death needs to be studied because something is happening in dying brains that our current models of consciousness cannot explain. And that is the most honest sentence anyone has said about this subject in a long time. Now here's where the two threads converge. The brain surge Borjigin documented. The verified perceptions Parnia recorded. The gamma wave spike Zemar captured in a human brain at the moment of death. They all point to the same uncomfortable possibility. That consciousness, whatever it actually is, and nobody fully knows, may not simply switch off when the heart stops. It may do something in those final minutes. Something real. Something that until very recently we had no instruments sensitive enough to detect. For most of human history, death was a wall. You walked up to it and you stopped. What was on the other side was the exclusive territory of religion and philosophy and fear. But science has now, very carefully, very quietly, begun to place instruments on the other side of that wall. And what those instruments are picking up is not silence. But let's be honest about what we don't know, because the honest answer matters more than a comfortable one. We don't know if the gamma wave surge in dying brains represents anything like conscious experience. It might be pure electrical noise. A system failing in a specific pattern that happens to resemble the pattern of consciousness without actually producing any. We don't know if the near-death experiences people report are happening during the cardiac arrest itself or in the confused minutes of resuscitation that follow. The timing is almost impossible to verify with current technology. We don't know what the brain is actually doing in those final minutes, only that it is doing something measurable and something unexpected. What we do know is this: the assumption that death is instantaneous is wrong. The assumption that the dying brain is simply going dark is wrong. The assumption that nothing worth measuring happens in the minutes between cardiac arrest and brain death is wrong. All three of those assumptions shaped medicine, shaped philosophy, shaped law, shaped the way we treat the dying and the nearly dead for centuries. And all three of them have now been quietly, carefully, scientifically dismantled. There is a 2019 paper in the journal Resuscitation that most people will never read. It documents a case in which a patient who had been in cardiac arrest for over an hour was successfully resuscitated. Over an hour. The boundary of what we call irreversible death keeps moving. And every time it moves, the question of what was happening inside that person's brain during all those minutes they were clinically gone gets harder to dismiss. Here's what this means for you. Right now, today, the legal and medical definition of death in most countries is cardiac death. Your heart stops. You are declared dead. But doctors have known for decades that this is a practical definition, not a biological one. Biologically, you are not fully gone the moment your heart stops. Your cells are still alive. Your brain is still doing something. The process of dying is still unfolding. And that process, that window between cardiac arrest and true irreversible biological death, is where every one of the most interesting findings in this space is located. The 7 minutes is not a myth. It's a rough estimate based on the outer boundary of how long brain cells can survive without oxygen before the damage becomes permanent. 4 to 6 minutes is the clinical standard. Some research suggests it can extend longer under certain conditions. Cold temperatures slow cellular death. Some resuscitation cases have pushed the boundary further than anyone expected. The window is real. What happens inside it is the question medicine is only now beginning to take seriously. And here is the part that should sit with you after this video ends. Every human being who has ever lived has eventually reached that window. Every person you have ever loved, Every person who shaped history, every person who looked up at the same stars you look at and wondered what was out there, they all went through those final minutes. And if the science is pointing in the direction it appears to be pointing, they did not go quietly. Their brains lit up. Something happened. Something that looked, electrically, like the most vivid conscious experience a human brain can produce. We have spent all of recorded history assuming that death was the end of experience. The new data suggests it might be the most intense experience of all. We don't know what that means yet. Maybe we never will, but the instruments are running. The data is coming in, and the picture it's building looks nothing like the silence we expected to find. Let's go back to the beginning, not of death, of our understanding of it. For most of human history, the line between life and death was not where we think it was. In ancient Egypt, the heart was believed to be the seat of consciousness. When it stopped, you were gone. The brain was considered so unimportant that during mummification, it was scooped out through the nose and discarded, thrown away. The organ we now understand to be the entire substrate of human experience was treated as biological filler, not worth preserving. In medieval Europe, people were so afraid of being buried alive that coffins were sometimes fitted with bells attached to strings inside. If you woke up underground, you could ring for help. The term dead ringer may come from this practice. The fear wasn't irrational. People were declared dead and buried before the process was complete. It happened often enough that the fear became cultural, became architectural, became bells and coffins. We have been getting death wrong for a very long time. The first serious scientific attempt to define death came in 1968 when an ad hoc committee at Harvard Medical School published a paper proposing a new definition: brain death, the irreversible cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem. This was a practical response to a specific medical problem. Ventilators had just been invented. They could keep a body breathing indefinitely even when the brain was gone. Medicine needed a new line, so it drew one. Brain death became the legal standard in most countries. It was a definition born not from perfect biological understanding, but from practical necessity. And it was a better definition than cardiac death. But it was still a definition, not a complete biological truth. Because here's what we now know: even brain death, the cessation of measurable electrical activity, is not necessarily the final moment of cellular life. Individual neurons can survive for hours after the brain flatlines. In 2019, a team at Yale University published a study in Nature that demonstrated something extraordinary. They took pig brains that had been dead for 4 hours. No heartbeat, no blood flow, no electrical activity for 4 hours. And they pumped a specially designed solution through them. The neurons began to show signs of cellular activity again. Not consciousness, not coordinated brain function, but metabolic activity at the cellular level. The cells were not as dead as the flatline suggested. The lead researcher, Ninad Sestan, was careful to say this did not mean the pigs were conscious or experiencing anything, but it meant the window between death and true irreversible cellular death was wider than the medical community had assumed. The boundary keeps moving. Every time science looks more carefully at the moment of death, the moment turns out to be less of a moment and more of a corridor. And the further into that corridor the instruments reach, the stranger the data becomes. So where does this leave us? In 2021, researchers published a review in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences examining decades of near-death experience research. They looked at the consistency of reports across cultures, across centuries, across people who had no contact with each other and no shared cultural framework for what they described. The tunnel, the light, the feeling of profound peace, the review of memories, the sense of a border that could not be crossed. These elements appear in accounts from medieval Europe, from ancient India, from modern American hospitals, from people who had never read a book about near-death experiences and had no idea what to expect. The consistency across that much cultural distance is either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of human testimony, or it is pointing at something real about the structure of the dying experience. The researchers did not conclude it was proof of anything beyond the physical, but they said it could not be dismissed as purely cultural projection. Something is producing these experiences. The question is what? And here is the most honest thing science can say right now. We have 3 data points that don't fit our existing model of consciousness and death: the gamma wave surge in dying brains, the verified perceptions during cardiac arrest, The cross-cultural consistency of near-death reports. None of them individually proves anything beyond what they directly measure. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern suggests that whatever happens in the minutes after your heart stops is not nothing. It is something. Something we don't have the right language for yet. Something our instruments are only beginning to be sensitive enough to detect. Something that every person who has ever lived has experienced, and none of them could come back to describe to us completely, except the ones who came back partway. And what they describe sounds less like nothing and more like everything. We built religions around death, we built philosophies, we built entire civilizations organized around the question of what happens after. And the answer we always assumed was either heaven or darkness, either something vast and eternal or nothing at all. But the data coming out of neuroscience labs and resuscitation wards in the last 30 years is pointing at a third option, a brief, intense, neurologically real experience in the minutes between heartbeat and cellular death. Not an afterlife, not nothing, something in between, something that happens inside the biology of dying itself, something that may be, in those final minutes, the most real thing you have ever felt. You are going to die. That remains the most certain fact about your life. But the story of what happens in those final minutes is not over. The instruments are still running, the data is still coming in, and the picture it's building looks nothing like the silence we spent centuries assuming we'd find on the other side. Maybe death is not a wall after all. Maybe it's the last thing your brain ever shows you, and maybe it shows you something worth seeing,